online through Teams, so you're very welcome as well. My name is Peter Gray. I'm the director of the Institute of Irish Studies. And it's my great pleasure to welcome to Queen's first time in 17 years.
17 years. Thank you, Peter.
My friend Frank Byrne, who is a historian of Irish republicanism, specialising in the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the Land Board, and Charles Stewart Parnell. He completed his doctoral thesis on the IRB and the Land Board in Cork, under the supervision of Bill Vaughan at Trinity College Dublin. And Frank is now a senior lecturer and head of department now, recently.
One of them, yes.
A head of department at CY Cergy, Paris University. And also he's a visiting research fellow at Trinity College Dublin. He's going to talk about his current research on the specific topic of the most wanted tourist. Sorry,
terrorist.
That's a Freudian slip. The most wanted tourist, the Invincible Frank Byrne in France, 1883. So
thank you very much. I think I'll stand and pull the microphone here. So first I need to thank a few people as well. Thank you, Peter, for this invitation. And the first time I ever gave a paper at a conference was here in Queen's. The University of Ulster got together for the Black Hand of Republicanism in 2008, which was the 150th anniversary of the Fenian Brotherhood being founded. And that was Professor Fergal McGarry and James McConnell organised that. So it's lovely to be back. Now, this paper is based on research I've been doing in Paris, looking at French archives. And I kind of needed a bit of help to break into, even though I'd been in France for many years. I always had this suspicion that there was going to be good stuff in the French archives that would be useful. And I got Sylvie Kleinman over on some funding from my university, because she was an expert on French archives, and she helped me a few years ago. So as you know, policing is very important in the sort of the way the government looked at Irish nationalism, Irish revolutionaries, etc. But one of the interesting things is that one of their influences in how they organized their policing was actually the French police, as we'll see later. And in terms of France and Irish republicanism, there was huge connections between France and the Irish revolutionaries. I recently put on an exhibition for the Irish Embassy in Paris and the Irish Cultural Centre on 1798 and the French involvement. And we were looking in the French military archives at a huge amount of material that is available there. Wolfe Tone's last letter to the French Directory is in there. And I had Micheál Martin visit recently. The embassy asked me to show him around, and the archives put out this collection of documents, including plans to invade Ireland from 1790, 1794, 1796, right up until 1902, where some French spy had gone around all the ports of Ireland photographing everything. Now, that all changed in 1903 with the Entente Cordiale. But up until 1903, the Irish were very confident and comfortable with the fact that the French would probably look kindly on them. Not always. Tone's wife was looked after by the French state. The last dossier we showed Micheál Martin was Samuel Beckett's resistance file, which was basically about his pension as a member of the French resistance. But I'm going ahead of myself there. In terms of Irish republicanism and the Fenian movement, which is my main area, we could really say that Fenianism begins in Paris, because the two founders of the Fenian movement, John O'Mahony and James Stephens, left Ireland after the 1848 rising and ended up in Paris, where basically they were students of secret societies. Now, the Paris of 1848 and afterwards was full of all these refugees from Poland, Russia, various other places, and they were all plotting to do something in their own places. So out of this sojourn in Paris, Stephens went to Ireland, O'Mahony went to the United States. Now, one of my problems as a researcher is there's always, this started on this date, this started then. You've got these very solid narratives, which don't often add up. But it's very nice to have a date like St. Patrick's Day, 1858. The IRB, or the Irish Republican Brotherhood, is founded in Dublin. But in fact, it's part of a process that continued. Now, in terms of the period I'm looking at, I study the Land War. And the Land War was a very interesting agreement between the American branch of Fenianism and Irish parliamentary politicians and others who were unhappy with a very orthodox movement in Ireland led by Kickham, who were very much against innovation. Now, the Americans, as I've shown in my thesis and other work, the Americans basically were sick of the way the Irish Fenian movement was operating. And before the Land War, before this compact, they were sending people to Ireland as kind of sleepers. And I found several of these when I was doing my PhD, who were very important in hollowing out the IRB in Ireland and taking it over at the time of the Land War. Now, I'll just briefly go through the history of the Land War. It's the Irish National Land League was founded in October 1879. It did virtually nothing for the first 9 months, except the most important thing in Irish nationalism, fundraising. Parnell went to the United States and raised about $50,000 very quickly, ran back to Ireland because an election had been called. But to get to that point, the meetings that the American Fenians and the Irish group of the IRB had were held in France, in Boulogne. The Land League itself, when it needed to have meetings away from the view of British spies, would do them in Paris also. And by early 1881, Parnell had been on trial with many leaders of the movement. The trial collapsed and the government introduced a Coercion Act in March 1881. This pushed the money of the IRB and the Land League, well, certainly the Land, I'm conflating the two, which often is the case. The Land League funds go to Paris with Patrick Egan. Now, today I'm looking at an Invincible. Now, the Invincibles were a supposed breakaway from the IRB. They were founded by a compact between American Clan na Gael people and Patrick Egan, and they recruited senior centres of the IRB in Dublin for a more physical force assassination grouping. Now, there's lots of books about the Invincibles. There's lots of books about the Phoenix Park murders, and despite that, even there's a very decent recent one by Julie Kavanagh, The Irish Assassins. Even with that, when I look at archival sources, I'm often finding things that puzzle me. Now, the Phoenix Park murders were, and the assassination of Tsar Alexander II were probably the two biggest assassinations in the late 19th century Europe. And in this era of media, these were global news stories. And certainly the Phoenix Park murders was never out of the papers for years and years afterwards. A huge investigation was instigated. In this book, there's very brutal descriptions of the actual murders. And just briefly, as part of the Coercion Act, many of the leaders of the Land League were arrested without trial, including Parnell, the Fenian Michael Davitt, and others. And in April 1882, Parnell was allowed out of prison to go to, of course, Paris, for the funeral of his nephew. In this period, there was negotiations, secret negotiations with the Prime Minister Gladstone in order to effect an end to the Land War as it had been. And by May 1882, Parnell is released on the 2nd, and Davitt is released on the 5th. In this period, the Chief Secretary of Ireland, and that was a government cabinet post, Forster, nicknamed Buckshot Forster for using shotguns on protesters, resigned in protest at this compact with the hardline nationalists, as he viewed Parnell and others. And his replacement was Frederick Cavendish, whose wife was a niece of Gladstone's wife. So a very close, cozy circle at the top of British government. Within a day of his arriving in Dublin, within 2 days of his arrival in Dublin, he was brutally slashed to pieces. And the descriptions in this book of bones being cut through, throats being cut, very graphic stuff. And this is done by a group of men who laid in wait in the Phoenix Park and basically butchered these two men. The other one was T.H. Burke, the Irish undersecretary, an Irish Catholic civil servant, very, very highly thought of administrator. Now, the aftermath of the Phoenix Park murders led to a huge investigation, which was led by a judge, well, by a barrister who had been only a year earlier one of the barristers on the Parnell trial. So all these things get very mixed together. Now, that's, I think, enough of an introduction, really. And I'm going to just jump forward to 1883. Now, in early 1883, the arrests of the leaders of the conspiracy, which is known as the Invincible, the Irish National Invincibles, etc., began to happen in Dublin. And a report from the Times on the 28th of February detailed that the Prime Minister Gladstone had had lunch at the British Embassy and he tried to call on Mr. Ferry. Ferry had just taken over as Prime Minister of France. They missed each other and dined together later that evening. So that was a happy moment for the two of them. The same report details at length the arrest the night before of a Frank Byrne. Now, it was noted that Byrne had arrived from Cannes 3 weeks before, was staying at a hotel on Rue Saint-Hyacinthe, registered under his own name, and this is an important point, but the Times said that he was perceiving that he was under the watch of British detectives, and he went out the night before, zigzagging around Paris before returning to his lodgings, and it gives the address, happily 338 Rue Saint-Honore. Now, Frank Byrne receives about 1.5 columns compared to a little paragraph about Gladstone and the French Prime Minister. So 10 months earlier, Gladstone had thought he had solved the Irish question. I think I've dealt with this. And he had the deal with Gladstone. His nephew-in-law gets assassinated, etc. Now, these murders had created, as I said, a great deal of publicity and a great deal of notoriety. Frank Byrne, who I just mentioned, and his wife had played an integral part in the Phoenix Park murders. Byrne himself was one of the founders of the Invincibles. His wife he had procured the knives that had been used in the assassination. His wife, according to informers, had brought them to Dublin, as well as a Remington rifle tied around her shoulder. She made another trip to Dublin a week later with pistols, etc. So the two Byrnes were very much involved in the murder. Frank Byrne himself was on the directory of the IRB in London for a very long time. He also was involved in the Home Rule movement, and later he became the secretary of the Land and Labour League, or basically the UK branch of the Land League. Now, as soon as these arrests, I think I'll get to that in another way, but as soon as these arrests happened, Frank Byrne flitted off to Cannes. Now, on 17th of February 1883, a letter was dispatched to the Prefect of Police signed by Viscount Lyon, the British ambassador to France, stating that he'd received a mandate, or basically a warrant, from the Secretary of State Foreign Affairs to arrest Citoyen Britannique Frank Byrne, accusing him of the assassination of Frederick, Cavendish, and D.H. Burke. I'll just a bit slow on my slides. There's Land League, as we can see, not very bright orange there, but the Land League wanted orange and green to come together and fight for, well, if you look at Land League posters around the border area, Cavan, Fermanagh, etc., it won't say God Save Ireland on them, but a lot of the rest of them we'll find is particularly nationalist slogan, God Save Ireland, which is drawn from the Manchester Martyrs and the unofficial national anthem written by T.D. Sullivan. You can also see they praised their American brothers and sisters, and indeed John McCafferty, a Confederate guerrilla fighter, was another one of the founders of the Invincibles. Which brings us to tourism. And this is Gladstone and his wife in Cannes in 1883. Now, excuse me, the ambassador stressed the importance of not letting Byrne escape because the Foreign Secretary absolutely wished to extradite him. Now, the Foreign Secretary at the time was Lord Grenville, and he was a cousin of the murdered Frederick Cavendish. The following day, Leon sent a further letter requesting the arrest of another Invincible, John Walsh, who was also in France at the time, if he could be found. Walsh was from Middleborough, another member of the IRP Supreme Council for the North of England. He was a Land Leaguer, and he was also a member of this organization, the Invincibles. Now, if you took the Times report at face value, about Byrne suspecting he was followed, trying to throw off his police escort, etc. That, if you take that at face value, it looks like a man trying to escape justice. However, when you dig into this, you start to get a very different picture. The entire Byrne affair cannot be taken at face value based on these police reports. For a start, his very well thought out hiding place was the same hotel as a certain Eugene Davis. Now, Eugene Davis was a former seminarian at the Irish colleges in both Leuven, where you're visiting soon, and in Paris. He had left the quest for priesthood, and he was working as the Irish correspondent of O'Donovan Ross's United Irishman. Now, the United Irishman was Ross's paper. I think it was founded in 1880, and it would be probably described as the newspaper of the dynamitards and the assassins. This was an absolute radical Irish-American journal that advocated bombing British cities, maximum pressure on the British state, etc. So just factor this in. Davis is the Paris correspondent of the United Irishman, and this is from 1882. So it's not as if the British detectives would have to work very hard. And the address of his lodgings is right there under the banner of the headlines, 332 Rue, etc. So you get the picture. This most wanted man in Europe is hanging out in Paris in the same hotel as someone who is absolutely on the radar of the British. It goes a little bit further, though. According to the Times, when French detectives arrived to arrest Byrne, he showed no surprise at all, which isn't a surprise, as we'll see. Byrne was described as about 35, well-dressed, intelligent-looking, with a red beard, and he showed no trace of emotion. The Times article was published 3 days after the arrest, and it delved into the French newspaper coverage of the affair, noting that L'Univers' account of the arrest was provided by one of Byrne's friends, and it claimed that he was working as a press agent in Caen, this is Byrne, when he found out about the arrest of his wife, and we'll get to that, on information. The account states that he intended to return to London only for the fact that his wife, having been released in Dublin, joined him in Paris. It noted that the Byrne's arrest had exacerbated the French revolutionary press, in particular the ultra-montagne l'Intransigeant, which defended Byrne. And it stated that Byrne, now the Intransigeant was a newspaper founded by an interesting character we'll see more of in a moment. The Intransigeant stated that Byrne had fought for France in 1870. He'd been part of Bourbaki's army. He was a foreigner who had generously offered his blood to France and is more French than many Frenchmen. So in a further element to the newspaper, it said the only thing lacking for the new Prime Minister, Ferry, was to be the gibbet purveyor, and the thing is done. Now, Ferry, as I said, was recently appointed Prime Minister of France for the second time, just 6 days before. Now, when I started to look around the French archives, I was actually looking for Parnell's file, as we'll see that later. And I came up with this file out of a box, which was full of documents about a foot of documents on Gambetta, who was on a more radical left-winger than Jules Ferry. And in this same collection, there was a dossier on Parnell. And I came up with this file. The handwriting, as you'll see, is a bit funny. I was thinking, why is there a file about me in here? Because it looked like Frank Rynne on the cover, but it's Frank Byrne. So I started leafing through this file. And in this file, there are documents which, for some reason, are conveniently arranged in chronological order. I wonder, is it the result of a careful police archivist, or sometimes it's the 19th century, some person who was really meticulous went through them and put them all in the correct order. Now, in that file, we can see that following Lyon's request for the arrest, several different hands wrote these descriptions of Byrne, like the one over here. And it was obviously a briefing, like in NYPD Blue, where the sergeant said to all the cops, you know, take this down, because and there's a big pile of them, all in different handwritings, with a description of Byrne. Describing as being 38 years old, 5 English feet, 10 inches, missing a finger, probably the result of his fighting for France, wearing a hairy grey Chester coat. Slightly more detailed description of Walsh is offered in another file, describing his hair, moustache, no beard, vulgar figure, height, military bearing, origins, etc. Now, 20th of February telegram was sent from Caen to Howard Vincent, the head of Scotland Yard. Now, Howard Vincent was one of these policemen who I mentioned earlier. He had actually gone and studied in the Sorbonne in 1876. One of the things he was studying was the French police. He had also been called to the bar, and he was asked to run the detective branch in a new detective branch in London. So he's a senior detective policeman looking to counter terrorism, I suppose we could call it today, in the UK. And this indicates that Vincent had spies in Caen already, but in fact there were British agents already in the mix way before this. The telegram he received said that Byrne had arrived in Caen on the 4th of February, left on the 12th for Paris, maybe in England. However, his letters were being forwarded to an address in Paris. At which case we can kind of see that the British, all through this process, the British police had a good idea of where Byrne might be, even while they were asking the French to look for them, etc. Now, it's also worth noting that certain Irish MPs also were aware that Byrne was in Caen, and they were so concerned that they approached Gladstone's son and visited Herbert Gladstone to warn him of a possible assassination attempt. A couple of days before Vincent received his telegram, the Home Secretary, William Harcourt, cabled the Lord Lieutenant in Ireland to say that he had been warned by MPs Justin McCarthy and John Barry that there was a risk to Gladstone's life from Byrne, that Byrne had gone to Paris. As it would subsequently turn out, Byrne was in Caen, not alone, but in the company of a man called Tynan, who was traveling under an alias Listel, and this comes out of the French police reports. Tynan was what's called number one, the main conspirator, according to the British, in the Phoenix Park murders. Now, another undated police report states that Byrne was in Paris, having arrived 3 weeks earlier from Caen. Now he was in a hotel on Rue Saint-Hyacinthe. This report noticed that he appeared bored rather than worried about the surveillance of the English detectives, who were quite obviously surveilling him. And this concerns the Times account describing a day. Sorry, this report confirms the Times account describing the day where Byrne took his cab, did it, as the report says, 1,000 circuits of Paris with multiple detours, then returned to his hotel, moved his belongings to the hotel he was later arrested in. So essentially, he zigzags all around Paris all day long, which is something that would attract quite a lot of attention, I think, especially when you know you're being followed, to go only back to the same hotel to move. Now, a good criminal would have had someone move while he was doing his zigzagging and tried to go to the hotel that he was moving to. But we'll come back to this sort of behavior later. Now, the French police were keeping Byrne under constant surveillance. This is very, very clear. And they built up an extremely repetitive account of his active social life in Paris. And this is why I call him notorious. And as the file builds up, reports come in about Walsh traveling under a pseudonym Listel, but in fact, this is probably the way I've looked at it, because this person is showing up in different places. I think they were using the same identity for 2 different people. One was Tynan, the other is Walsh, which is, again, more confusion. On the 22nd of February, a telegram arrived to Vincent at Scotland Yard, from Vincent at Scotland Yard to the Parisian police, hoping that their surveillance was a success, and informing the prefect that the official extradition demand was ready. The same day, a letter issued from the Ministry of Justice Criminal Division stating that the prefect had received a mandate from Dublin requesting the extradition of Byrne. Now, this was an arrest warrant signed by John Addy Curran, who wrote a very good reminiscence of his life at the bar, which is available online on archive.org, etc. Curran had been a very young barrister at the time and had showed himself to be extremely adept in the trial as a defence barrister in the trial of Parnell and others in 1880. Now, another surveillance report from the same day, but likely out of date, noted that Byrne and Lisdell were staying at Hotel de Lunds. It gives the room numbers, etc. And this is the day that the Ministry of Justice confirmed all the official documentation was needed for the extradition request for Byrne to proceed. And of course, this is where the fun starts to begin. Now, the whole affair, as I mentioned earlier, but just if you want interested in dates, this whole affair had begun when, on the 16th of January, the police in Dublin had pounced on the Fenians, and it became immediately clear that one of their own, one of the IRB head centres for Dublin, Carey, was an informer. Carey identified a woman who had transferred the knives to Dublin that were used to butcher Cavendish and Burke, etc., as Byrne's wife. Now, the newspapers were publishing these details, and a subplot in the Byrne story is the arrest of his wife. And she was transported to Dublin in the exact same period, 19th of February, so that Carey could identify her. Now, Carey had met this woman many times, but when she was brought into his presence, he said he didn't know her and couldn't identify her. He would later say that he had identified enough people. Whether this is a supra plot or whether this was all thought out is impossible to say, but there are ample accounts that cover the fact that Mrs. Byrne had been the conveyor of the knives, ammunition, etc. Now, going back to the Times, 21st of February reported that she was returning to London. However, on the 23rd of February, the French police reported that she was in Paris. The hotel that Byrne stayed in was under intense surveillance, and from police reports, we can surmise that the couple went to bed at 3:30 in the morning on the 24th of February because their lights went out. The next day, news that the French Minister of Interior's authorization for the arrest of Byrne was conveyed to the ambassador. And the day after this, whether they were aware of this or not, Byrne and his wife were swanning around the cafes of Paris. They visited the bar at the Folie Bergère. They went to cafes on the Rue de Bac, the Rue de Pas, and a cabaret. Now, if you have a monopoly board for Paris these days, Rue de Bac and Rue de Pax will be the ones with the most expensive buildings. So we're looking at both sides of the Seine, the Latin Quarter, and very nice part of town, Boulevard Saint-Germain, etc. Now, he was especially busy on this day in the cafes. He spent an hour and a half at one, followed by a stop at Café Anglais, and then going to Café Pourleau, 6 Rue de Bac between 6 and 7. Then he ate at a restaurant. Then he returned to 16 Rue de Bac. Then he returned to the Pourleau. So if you imagine this most wanted man, he's going around from, I don't know if we have an equivalent, it's like Bewley's in Grafton Street to Bewley's in Westmoreland Street to, you know, the Westbury Hotel in Dublin for a meal, and then going over to a Michelin star restaurant, and, you know, trying not to be seen, of course, in all these she parts of Paris. While swanning around Paris that day, they met the extremist brothers, the Casey brothers, who were 2 Irish Athenians, and then they returned to their lodgings about 15:15 midnight. Now, they were probably, I come back to that one, they were probably celebrating, I think I have it later on, they were probably celebrating the fact that on the 26th, the same day, an interview from Paris had appeared in a French newspaper. And this interview in the Inver basically had Byrne denying he was in a secret society. And the paper was noting that Byrne was being accused by the British papers of being in Cannes to assassinate Gladstone. So when you kind of add up all of this, we're getting a very strange picture of a man on the run. And indeed, a strange picture of 2 different police forces treating this man as if he's on the run. Now, Joseph Casey, one of the brothers, had a long involvement in Irish nationalism. He had also fought against the Prussians with Frank Byrne in 1870. He also had worked and did work as a printer on many different Parisian radical left newspapers, including the Intransigent and we come to Henri Rochefort, etc. Now, later, as things, small world, etc., later, James Joyce's father would move to a house beside Casey's father in the north of Dublin. And when James Joyce was in Paris in 1903, he would meet up with Joseph Carey, and Carey would give him some small sums of money. And Joseph Carey was described by Joyce as the last of the old Fenians. And he appears in Ulysses as the character Kevin Egan, which kind of conflates the Patrick Egan, treasurer of the Land League, former treasurer of the IRB. Now, on the 27th, a translation of the official requests of the arrest and original letter had arrived, and that morning, 7:10 a.m., Byrne was sleeping when the police arrived and invited him to come to the prefecture. A telegram to a newspaper in London the following morning noted that Gladstone had put Anglo-French relations on a good footing by meeting Ferry. Frank Byrne's arrest and accusations appeared in the Intransigent newspaper, and with claims that the government were given in, the French government were given in to British demands. By the 1st of March, a report sent to by telegram to Rome stated that the French government was hesitant to extradite Byrne, and the affair had become serious. It was a busy day for Walsh also, because he was arrested in Le Havre, and the left-wing French press started publishing accounts of both these arrests and began to put the new government under extreme pressure. The intransigents railed at the news, reporting that the government of Queen Victoria was demanding Byrne's extradition, and that the French police ignored the energetic arguments of Byrne, noted as being the secretary of the Land League in Britain. He said en français, il est combattu pour la France, and comme sergent dans l'armée Burkery. It was basically, avec son ami Casey, etc. So it's building this case that these two dudes are heroes of the French military, and that the British are coming after them. Now, Henri Rochefort is an interesting character. He was a Viscount who, a bit like some of the United Irishmen, renounced his aristocracy. He was closely aligned with the Communards, the French Commune of Paris. He was an ally of, he had been a journalist for Le Figaro. He was fired by them in the 1860s for writing inflammatory material. He was extremely close to Victor Hugo. He was an anti-monarchist. And it's one of the things that a lot of the French left would have had in common with Irish nationalists. However, strangely enough, I was asked to do a paper on anti-monarchanism and Irish republicanism, and I didn't bother because there's not a huge amount of statements against the monarchy from Fenians that I have found. I don't know if you've seen any of this. They tend to talk about the English and landlords or all sorts of other things, but they don't talk too much about the monarchy. Now, Rochefort built his reputation as a communard, was on a more radical left than the French government. The French government at the time under Ferry called themselves Republican Gauche, but Hugo, etc., were on a more extreme left-wing tack. Now, an editorial that Rochefort wrote eviscerated the new government in a brutal fashion. He praised Gambetta, saying that Gambetta had always remained aloof of subservience to the British. And so he's using these very, nice turns of phrase to pull the rug out from under Jules Ferry's character. He refers to him as a dictator and claims that he's following in the line of the other dictator, by whom he means Napoleon III, who had been deposed in 1870. And he railed that the French government would be willing to he likened Byrne to another very recent case, which is very important, I think, in the whole thinking here, which is that of a guy called Hartmann, who had been arrested 2 years earlier under pseudonym Meyer in Paris. And he had been involved in a plot, he had executed a plot indeed, to kill Alexander II, the Tsar. He had bought a house outside St. Petersburg and put a bomb by the railroad track. That plot was not successful, and off he went to France. So Rochefort was saying to deliver Byrne to England now would be to send him to the gallows like Hartmann if he had been delivered to Russia. And he goes on to say, we learn with horror, but without any surprise, that on the denunciation of an Irish snitch, Cafford, named Carey, a witness in the trial brought against the alleged assassins of Sir Thomas Burke, our friend Byrne, secretary of the Land League, was arrested, etc. Now, this phrase, our friend, is used often by Rochford, referring to various Irish people. And he goes on, this is the main editorial on this, on the Lynch engines reporting on this. He also goes on about Parnell's right-hand man, J.J. O'Kelly, who's also our friend. And he was saying that we learned only a few days before, without any surprise, that on the denunciation of an Irish sitch, etc. He also went on to say that O'Kelly had said that in the recent coercion period, that 10 men, of the 14 people who'd been executed, at least 10 had had nothing to do with the murders that they had been accused of. He went on further against the French government, saying, we would return the nihilists and the Fenians to you. On the other hand, you would return the socialists to us. So there was this, he was really talking about a history of French politics where people like Victor Hugo had spent 20 years in Belgium and in Guernsey. Rochford himself had to flee and spent time in Belgium and in England. So there's this tradition of exile, and he's basically putting it to Ferry that you have to stand up for the nihilists, the anarchists, and the Fenians, who are all being lumped together. Now, interestingly enough, in the French police archives, they're all lumped together as well, being looked after by the same by the same police groupings. Now, Rochford could sound like O'Donovan Rossa as well. For more than 500 years, the great victim called Ireland has been robbed, starved, depopulated by this vampire called England. So this type of rhetoric, it begins to appear daily, not just in the French radical left intransigent, but it's being copied by other papers, being wired out on the services. In the dossier on Byrne, there are any telegram that mentions him that goes out of Paris is stuck in there. Reuters reports, other news agents, La Havas, all the different wire service reports are in there as well. So the police are basically picking up on everything that's been said by the media and by anyone else who mentions Byrne in this period. Now, the Byrne affair served a great political purpose to the French left. For Rochford, he was able to attack not just Ferry, but the prefect of the police of Paris was a political ally of Ferry, a guy called Kamikaze, and he was aligned to these Republican gauchists, and he became a central villain for the left in the case as well. Now, it's interesting that also, if you wanted to get, the French translation for the arrest warrants, we've got a 20-page translation of Carey's statement into French. The French are very careful. Everything has to be translated. Now, not all the translations are fully accurate. So as this story rolls on every morning, the French left are really having fun. They're also noting in such a way that it gets picked up by the international media at the time. And indeed, a decade later, in the report in the New York Times announcing Byrne's death, one of the things that's mentioned in a very short article is that his release from France was secured by the French extreme left. So the fuss they kicked up was well noted globally at the time. Now, on the 3rd of March, the paper began to criticize the French police, decrying their treatment of Byrne, and they were giving details of his handcuffing, etc., etc. However, for Byrne, his exile in Paris took a very interesting turn. And whether it was anything to do with the left or not, I'm not sure. However, his celebrity was such that the director of the French prisons was writing more than once a day to the Interior Ministry, giving full details of Byrne's day. And I think this is this type of thing you love as a historian to find. is penning these reports of Byrne's activities. Having arrived the night before, he had lunch on the 2nd of March of a coquelette, frites de pomme de terre, and a demi-bottle de vin. So he's got a half bottle of wine, lamb chops, and chips. His wife and Mr. Casey spent 4.5 hours with him, and he received 3 letters, including one from the Secretary of the League to Protect the Citizens from Abuse. This is a French organization to protect citizens from abuse, who had written to the papers to say, we will take on Mr. Casey's cause. So this is starting, now Paris isn't a big city, this is starting to become fun for everyone who's screaming. He received several English language books and newspapers. The next day, his wife stayed 6 hours, and by the 3rd day, he was requesting 2 café au lait at 7 a.m. and feasting on coquelette salad and the ubiquitous wine, and requesting tobacco. Following a 6.5-hour visit from his wife and Eugene Davis, he dined on beef steak and salad. His 2 coffees, comme habitude, were demanded later on subsequent days. We may surprise that his copious consumption of free wine were rendering a little bit sleepy, because he had started to demand a full bottle instead of a demi-bottle after a couple of days. So he must have been getting a little bored. Now, by the 7th of March, he had received multiple visitors, including journalists. He dined on a potage of vegetables, steak, and had returned to his half bottle of wine, probably getting ready for what he knew was about to happen next. Now, a few days earlier, sensing that Byrne might be getting miserable, his Confederates, Casey and Davis, were reported by Le Clarion on the 4th of March to have visited Victor Hugo, who was concerned for the innocence of Byrne, and Davis and Casey were said to have promised to provide him with proof within 2 days. Now, this was a key part of Byrne's strategy, because the UK paperwork was accusing him of murder, and Byrne had been nowhere near the Phoenix Park on the 6th of May, 1882. Byrne had been quite happily in England doing business and doing his thing. And this is a key issue in French reports, because the French government are getting increasingly nervous, because they would not, in one case, they were nervous about ever extraditing someone for a political murder. And on the other side, they've got affidavits saying that he's involved in a murder, but he wasn't in the country the murder took place. And this in French law presents difficulties. Ironically, in the trial I mentioned of Parnell earlier, one of the precedents that came up in that trial, even though Parnell, etc., were let off, and it's a precedent that is in British law or UK law to this day, was that a conspiracy can be held without people knowing each other, without people communicating with each other, without people having anything to do with each other or knowing of each other's existence, as long as they are following a common purpose. This did not exist in French law at this time. So there's a legal problem, despite all the paperwork being perfect. Now, the same day, 4th of March, another police report comes in saying that the anarchists, the dreaded anarchists, were going to have a meeting at the Salle Rivoli on Rue Saint-Antoine, and at this meeting, which was expected to be attended by a lot of people, the government was going to be severely attacked. Now, by the time Byrne is cutting out his wine consumption, 7th of March, the police were aware that the government were going to go no way on this. And they had said that the government, having decided on the 7th to release, to not extradite Byrne, that he should therefore be released. On the 7th of March, his release was announced by the press, and fly along there. I don't know why I thought that was my name, but there you go. Yeah, they're the beautifully this is an archivist loves good handwriting. I always love reading police reports from Dublin, because the RIC and the Dublin Metropolitan Policemen have lovely handwriting. This is the superintendent of the Seine, the prisons of the Seine, writing the daily menus of Frank Byrne, etc., etc. So the rumours that the government were going to reject his extradition were well known. And on the 8th of March, there's your anarchist report here, the 8th of March, Leon Transit triumphantly relayed the events that led up to Byrne's release, and they published an interview with him. In fact, Byrne, when they went to visit Victor Hugo, they were well aware that already in place was a mission to get various affidavits from people in London, in the UK, to bring them physically to France. And the intransigent reports on the 8th of March that a certain Francis Porter, a book dealer from London, had come over with 5 different letters, including an affidavit from Porter, including a telegram that Porter had received on the 6th of May the year before from Frank Byrne, sent from Liverpool, including an affidavit from A.M. Sullivan, the TD, whose brother wrote the God Save Ireland, and others, which basically gave an alibi to Byrne. Now, this is an alibi for him not being physically in the Phoenix Park, but it's not an alibi for him not being a conspirator in the Invincible plot, etc., etc. However, with the focus on the left, from the left, with the ambiguities in French law and the fact that the fragility of French politics at the time, the government basically said, we're not going to stand with the British on this one. As it turns out, both Walsh and Byrne are released from custody. And on the 18th of March, it was reported, this is the one I mentioned earlier, which details various issues to do with Byrne, the assassination, etc., etc. Even before, on the 18th of March, it's reported that Byrne was off to Le Havre. Now, if you read reports in books, etc., about Byrne and newspapers, the British weren't finished with him yet. Someone posing as a Polish count offered him to take a ride on his yacht around the bay, etc., and Byrne sussed that he was probably a British agent and refused. Eventually, he gets onto a steamer for New York, and Julie arrives, to great fanfare from the American nationalist newspapers, etc., and is much welcomed. Now, so the point is then, given that this is the most mounted man in Europe, can we unpick this a little bit and see, well, what was this all about? Because when Byrne went to France, he telegraphed a guy who was working as a journalist for a wire service called Bussy. Now, Frederick Bussy was a journalist who was also known to be the best friend of the head of the G division of the Dublin Metropolitan Police, Superintendent Mallon. So you're basically flagging to the best friend of the superintendent of the police, who's been tracking Fenianism for a decade, that you're coming to Cannes to replace you as the journalist who is shadowing the Prime Minister of the UK. So from the very moment he had decided to come to France, he's flagging, I'm coming to France. And one would wonder why. And one of the things I've always been worried about when you look at Fenianism is there's an orthodoxy in studying Irish nationalism, which is these guys are nationalist heroes, this, that, the other, that you can believe what they say. If they say they weren't in the movement, then you have to believe that. What I've found in my research is, and I've proved it many times, is that when someone who is in a sworn secret society says something, you should potentially take it with a pinch of salt. And this goes to experiences I've had with people who were in the IRA in 1916 to 22 with relatives of mine, and they were asked by other relatives of mine in the 1960s, did they know what happened? And oh, merda, they didn't. And in the case of, the Fenian movement, there's an awful lot that we do not know because it isn't spoken about. But one thing we do know in this case is that Frank Byrne and Parnell were extremely close. He was the secretary of the Land League in Britain. But beyond that, he had the run of the House of Commons rooms for the Irish Party. Indeed, in reports, you will see it in this book, that the knives that were used in the Phoenix Park murders were being shown to people in the rooms of the Irish parliamentarians in the Palace of Westminster before they were transported to Dublin. And in the case of Parnell, this case would rumble on for another several years, because when some years later, the Times Parnell Special Commission is looking into accusations of Parnell and crime, one of the big issues that's brought up to basically say that Parnell was a director of assassination and murder was the Frank Byrne case, because Parnell had given Byrne £100, which is not an insignificant amount of cash, and that enabled him to go to France in February or in January. So Parnell was linked into this, but this, I think, is even more interesting. At this time, they're very aware of the French political situation. They're very aware of Hartmann and this cause célèbre not being extradited from France to Russia. And in 1881, Parnell visits Paris. And who is he in the company of? Henri Roquefort and Victor Hugo. Indeed, a major event was a dinner organized for Parnell at Victor Hugo's house, at which a great number of politicians were invited, some of whom wouldn't go because they were nervous about Parnell's radicalism. And you can follow, that's a whole other story you can follow online. But essentially, Frank Byrne would have been fully aware of the support network that existed in France for him and his cause. He would have been fully aware of the fact that he could link in with a very big bully pulpit, and that he would have connections with the most revered living playwright and revered socialist of the day, Victor Hugo. And again, essentially the entire plot, as I see it, is that Byrne's entire presence in France was provocative. It was not unlike other issues to do with the IRB, the Clan na Gael, the land war, etc., it was about publicity. It was about bloodying the nose of the British in the face of international media and press coverage. And it was all done with a fairly sure idea that they would get out of it. Now, is there a smoking gun on that? Mostly to do with the circumstantial issues. And the circumstantial issues are he was never hiding in Paris. He was aware he was being followed. It was reported that 2 days before he was arrested, the concierge in the hotel had approached him and said, I was being asked questions by British detectives this morning. So they were aware all the way through. He was signaling his presence in France all the way through. And the issue was really to create another Catalpa or one of these kind of spectaculars, but in a way that would assure maximum publicity for the cause, maximum speaking about the cause, and ensure that Byrne and his compatriots slipped away. In the end, Byrne slipped away, Tynan slipped away, Walsh slipped away, and years later they would be described as being the only two people who escaped from the Invincible conspiracy in the New York Times. This isn't true. Many of the Invincibles, like Tynan, escaped. Who didn't escape, of course, was the IRB head centre, James Carey, who a couple of months after the Byrne affair is murdered on a boat off the... and then Frank Byrne shows up in New York. And in New York, he never admitted to being a member of the conspiracy. He did say he was active in the Land League, and he did say that he did say that many different methods could be used in the fight for Irish nationalism. In the National Library, a few years, not long after I found some of this stuff, I was going through the Devoy papers, and there was a little thing that looks like a raffle book, and it has basically receipts for donations, and there's Frank Byrne's name there. It's the exact same signature on the police reports that he signed, or the police interviews that he signed in Paris. And essentially, this type of affair is not uncommon in the grandiosity of the Clan na Gael and Fenian movement. And another issue is that it is extremely media-led. You know, we think about Elon Musk and Twitter, etc., etc. John Devoy, who was like one of the leading lights of Irish nationalism, very interesting, his papers, all the money, etc., that's coming through. But Devoy was a newspaper writer and publisher. Right across this movement, we have writers and publishers of newspapers. They were journalists, they wrote, they did books, etc. So they're very aware of the value of publicity. Now, Byrne did speak forcibly, advocating dynamite campaigns, etc. As time went on, he ended up living in Providence, Rhode Island. Him and his wife were happy enough in New York for about 10 years. And he was significant enough that on his death, the New York Times carried a small column about him. But noting, again, that a demand for his extradition was made, and the French government seemed inclined to accede to it, but only Rochefort and other members of the extreme left put an end to that. Now, just by way of French archives, I'm going to finish up on this. What's interesting looking at this particular French archive and the Parnell, and that's just two dossiers in one archive, the French Préfecture of Police, is that you can see into, through the French language reports, etc., you can sort of open up on the sort of this is Byrne hiding out, etc. As soon as you look into the French archives, you see that he's not hiding out, that he's a public figure, etc., etc. He's swanning around. He's being a tourist. He's sort of saying, catch me, do what you can, and being very provocative about it. When we look at the Parnell archives, it's quite interesting because the French were very interested in him, and they were collecting all the newspaper reports of Parnell at a time when he was a radical and associated with the French left. But as that file builds up, it becomes much more respectful, and the reports are treating him much more like a statesman, etc. And in terms of Rochefort, a very interesting character. Rochefort ended up, as I said, he was a communard, extreme left, friend of Hugo. Within a decade, he had lined up with a General Boulanger. Now, the Boulangerists are seen by some historians today as a kind of a proto-fascist movement. They were in theory on the extreme left politics, but within Boulanger committed suicide on his wife's, on his mistress's grave in 1891, very romantic, in Brussels. He had tried to stand for French president and had been forced out of the race. Rochefort went on to become one of the leading anti-Dreyfusards on the extreme right of French politics, and this is all within about 18 years of his heroic moments in the French Commune. My last point about archives today is this little item here. Now, Patrick Egan is one of the people who started the Invincibles. He's a very interesting character. He ended up, I think, as the American ambassador to Panama or somewhere later. He was also a very good bookkeeper. He'd been on the Supreme Council of the IRB. He'd been asked to stand as an MP many times. He's one of these, you know, the 1/7 of the iceberg appears above the water kind of characters in Irish nationalism. But this is another little document. I've seen different versions of this, but it's basically an accounting to John Devoy of Fenian funding, of land league funding for a period in 1881, and it amounts to $930,000, which is about £250,000 sterling. And if we look at that in real figures today, I think we're looking at something like £20 million or more. And another interesting part of this, and it shows you again, the trial I keep mentioning, the Queen versus Parnell, is referred to, somewhere here, it should be there. There. $105,000. That's $105,000 was spent on the defence of Parnell and others. In the House of Commons, someone asked a question of Forster at one point, how much the government spent on the trial, and it was £9,000, which is about 2.5 times less than the Fenians were able to spend. I'll leave it at that for today. Thank you very much. I hope you have questions. I hope we're able to answer the questions.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks, Frank, for shining light on that rather murky area.
And it probably doesn't
history.
Linking the two very much.
Yeah. So we can take questions obviously from people in the room and also people online. If you want to ask a question, just raise your hand digitally, and Becca will alert us. Anyone like to start? Some questions for Frank?
What did he die of? Pretty young, was he?
He was pretty young. His wife was extremely ill. I didn't see a cause of death. She had some sort of infectious disease. But then again, certain life expectancy, 50 or so, he would have been, 49, he was 50, 55. Potentially not that bad. Born in 49, nothing really. He grew up in Lancaster. There's nothing really that I found that says what he died of. I don't think it was suicide or anything dramatic.
Sean.
Ingenious reconstruction. I see a brilliant. The only thing is, it's a very high-risk strategy, isn't it? If he goes to France, hoping to be arrested, anything goes wrong, you can have his neck loose.
Absolutely. But one would ask how it was potentially easier for him to get to France than to get on an American steamer at that exact moment. So there could have been an issue like that. The other subplot there, though, is, and this probably makes a little bit of sense, perhaps there was a double mission in that Tynan was with him in Caen. And is there a potential that they were actually seriously considering killing Gladstone? And so it was there was a subplot of assassination. I have seen this referred to in the press. I haven't found anything that he has never said anything about it. Tynan has never said anything about it. But is there a potential that they were seriously considering killing Gladstone? And in which case, as loyal fighters for the Irish Republic, they would have been justified in taking such a risk.
But they would want to keep their heads down. So really trying to kill Gladstone.
Well, he was keeping his head up, but Tynan wasn't keeping his head up. So, but it's a very difficult thing. Yes, a huge amount of risk in the strategy, but where else was he going to go? I would say there was a lot of attention on American shipping at that stage. But it's something to look into more, to see when the police started looking at the American ships. But I think they were looking at them all the time, because that's another issue at this particular time. Is in 1881, you have the start of the dynamite campaign, and they were super focused on American steamers leaving the UK and entering the UK, and the police were searching all of them because they were sending their, what do they call them, infernal machines, fully made from Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Yes, that was a really enjoyable talk. I was just wondering, this comes about a decade or so after the Paris Commune and the extraordinary violence that came as a result of that. Is there a nervousness with the French government that they're harboring someone who's likely a terrorist, or at least someone who has been accused of serious violent political crimes? Is there any kind of nervousness about that? And furthermore, is there a discussion in the press or sort of a legacy in that? Maybe there is.
Well, you see, the French government was France's political system or political scene after the deposing of Napoleon III was extremely fraught. The governments were very fragile, and many of them had been on the left, not necessarily as extreme left as the communards, but people like Rochefort had been with the communards. So there was a huge amount of the activists in the French political scene at a national level were actually on the hard left and had been sympathetic and indeed involved in it. So I think France at this stage, if you look at the police files, I mean, there's loads of others I could throw into this, nihilists and anarchists all in France and Paris at the exact same time. So I think it was a bit of an attractor. I think it was one of the safer places in Europe at the time. For example, Bismarck had an absolute loathing of socialism. The French all the political parties that were being successful in the 1880s in France had the word gauche in them, that there was just one gauche or another gauche. So I don't think they would have been worried on that scale. British diplomatic influence on them was another issue. And I don't think it was as strong in this period as it had been, let's say, in 1848. But yeah, I mean, if you're interested in this type of the anarchists and the nihilists and all the rest, this French archive on the Préfecture de Police is just box after box of them from all over Europe, Germans, Russians, Irish, etc. So they're basically part of the mix. Sophie?
Thanks for that. I did my master's on British policing responses to dynamite campaigns. So this took me back.
Very good.
I was wondering about, you mentioned the kind of personal connections between the British police and the French police. Do you know if, like, Vincent was, you know, in the Sorbonne with some of the leading French, or like, are there these personal connections, or is it all?
Well, I haven't gone into what Vincent was up to in great detail, but if he was studying the French police, he must have had connections with them. And he seems to be very cordial with them when he's telegramming back and forth. And another person you'd have come across who shows up in this folder is Jenkinson, who seems the head of Irish branch special, was he? But probably higher at that stage. And the two of them are completely are in touch with the French detectives. But I was kind of puzzled though, because I looked at the DMP files for this period and from the 1860s on, and they're meticulous and beautifully done. You probably looked through them yourself. But what really astounded me was how identical the French files are to the Dublin files. The way the records are kept is the exact same way. The numbering, this is boring stuff unless you're an archivist, but the way the files are numbered, the way they're listed is the exact same way as the CSROP in Dublin. So it's obviously how you run an empire.
Excellent talk. It was quite interesting also to see the contrast between the way the British and French legal systems operate and like how what level they were on in terms of civil rights and rule of law in the late 19th century. Quite different, obviously. So my question would be more on context, because I'm like my own research touches on this because I'm looking into the Rory of the Hills movement in the context of the land war. So obviously there we have the connection with the land league. So you mentioned Kickham in the beginning. Yeah. So they and like him and Byrne would have been adversaries, you say, or how would you put that?
This is a very interesting question, because in theory, I'll take another example. In theory, Kickham and Byrne would have been adversaries. And then in theory, John Devoy and O'Donovan Rossa would have been adversaries in the United States, because O'Donovan Rossa is screaming, you know, blow them all up. And John Devoy is saying, oh, let's have a deal with Parnell. When I look into these guys, you'll find that they're all very, very close. And whereas one might express one thing and another express another, a couple of years later, they're all together again. And I think, I'll come back to Rory of the Hill in a moment as well, but I think when you look at when the IRB in Ireland was completely overthrown in the summer of 1880, to the extent that like the Cork IRB were getting up on a carriage with Parnell in the carriage, and a guy shows up with a pistol and gets them off the carriage. Within a year, the same guy, like I've looked at the same characters, these are part of the Doran IRB, the same characters are all together again after the land war, and they're organizing activities in West Cork again. So one moment they're sort of taking over, and the next thing they're back together again. So there's a very fluid interaction in Irish nationalism, whereas they might fight, and they often fought over money. They all believed in the same thing. And another very key example of that is Lomansey. Now, Lomansey was John Devoy's best friend. And if you go through Devoy's letters, Lomansey is there all the way through. But Lomansey and in theory, Devoy isn't in favor of the dynamite campaign. So his best pal ends up getting blown up, trying to blow up, I think it's Hammersmith Bridge. And then Devoy is very concerned looking after his wife. But Lomansy, in theory, was on the other side of the faction. Then he's so to be quite honest with you, and I go a little bit against the grain of some of my friends who've written about these things, but I don't take what might seem publicly the stated situation as fact. Now, it's true, Kickham, you know, he hated certain people like John O'Connor, but I don't think he really hated Patrick Egan to the same extent as O'Connor. O'Connor got up his nose an awful lot. And there were other characters all around the scene that never quite fell out with Kickham. They did their own thing and they're moving around. And again, it comes back to Long John O'Connor, a different O'Connor, who stated under oath many times that he had been a Fenian in '67, but is no longer one. And I have absolute proof that he was still involved in IRB activities at the time. You're studying the land war. And I mean, I've come across a lot of threatening notices during my thesis. And they basically, in the period of the land war out in West Cork, are literally the IRB cadre, just coming up with the old 1830s threatening letters, watch out for Rory, etc.
That is interesting because I suspected that the IRB, or at least parts of the IRB, were behind this the whole time, that they planned this from 1870 when it first starts in Rory at the Hills, and then allied with remnants of the earlier agrarian rebels, as you say, in the 1830s.
Well,
and I always find it quite ironic that, as you say, Kickham was on the other side of this factionally, but even if that's to be taken with a grain of salt, but then his ballad would become the moniker for that kind of.
Exactly. But the funny thing is, you see, if you think about what Kickham was actually saying, it's a bit like what Kickham was basically saying was, you can't go into the House of Commons. He basically wanted. He was an Orthodox Fenian who basically believed that, and he changed for a year or two conveniently in the mid 1870s, but he basically believed that the Irish Republic had to be achieved, could only be achieved through force of arms. So that's his orthodoxy. But I'm sure on the sidelines of all this, he's very amused with certain of these activities. The other ironies that we'll see, though, if you go into this, is John O'Leary. When they started dynamiting Britain, O'Leary lost his mind. He thought it was the worst thing that could ever happen. This was letting down. So there's, these, I think one of the things I always try and do is use imagination. These people are human. They're very different sort of morals sometimes. But at the same time, they're caught up in a conspiracy, a secret society. And despite, outcries and giving out about each other, you still see them coming back together again, decade after decade. But I'm very interested in your research.
Would you mind if I email you about this?
No, and I'll have a look at some. I have some beautiful hand-drawn Rorys from.
You two can follow up on that. Yeah. Becca, have any questions online? Anybody waiting to ask?
Two notes of thanks.
Yeah, great. Do you want to read them out?
Yes, Valerie Dawes says, thank you, very interesting, and a gift that says awesome. And Dr. Ida Milne says, thanks, very fascinating.
Thank you very much. And thank you for coming. I know it's a nice sunny evening. We probably have better things to do than talk about Fenians.
So everyone asked any questions they have before we finish? So I'm going to just a quick one for clarification, Frank. So Rynne's strategy, his defense strategy, is essentially to say, I wasn't there. So I
he called him Rynne. So I did the same thing.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. You see, I did his strategy was, I was the secretary of the Land League, yes. The Land and Labour League. Yes. I was in the UK.
Yeah.
And
does he use his position in France to defend, in principle, the activities of the Invincible?
Absolutely not.
He doesn't, right?
No, he just denies that he was anything to do with that secret society.
Yeah.
And he claims to be, and then he's called our friend, the secretary. He's been addressed in a very respectful fashion in the left press. Our friend, the secretary of the National League, and etc. Now he'd have been lynched if he'd been not lynched. He'd been certainly, the hemp ropes that they were talking about in the left-wing papers, he'd have certainly had one of them around his neck had he made it back to Dublin, on the evidence of Carey, like several other people. Now, you reminded me of something else. I did say it at the beginning. Over and over again, I come across archival material to do with the Phoenix Park murders that puzzles me. And I keep forgetting where it was, but I remember about 20 years ago in the National Library, I was looking through, I think you can find it, there's a catalogue of stuff there. And it was stuff that had been seized. And one of them is one of the Mullet's diary. And the diary entry for the day of, or the day after, the morning after the Phoenix Park murders, is this thing about, that the chief secretary has been slashed to death, and it's a terrible day, and all this type of stuff. And there's another report that I wanted to find for this, but I have it on another hard drive, of Patrick Egan being observed by a journalist coming out of his hotel, picking up the daily newspaper, reading about the Phoenix Park murders, and holding his head in his hands on the streets in Paris. Now, what that means, I don't know. I can't get into their minds, but it's interesting. Maybe he said, "Oh my God, what have we done?" Or they've killed the wrong one, because Cavendish was supposedly going to be quite friendly to Ireland, or it was just a show. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Queen.
So we look forward to this coming out in publications in the future.
I would like to do a tiny book on it.
Excellent. So just a reminder to people, we do have a seminar next week, 31st of March. It'll be Colleen Taylor, who's our visiting faculty, Irish Studies faculty exchange from Boston College, talking about ecological criticism in Ireland, the sea in particular. Okay.
The sea or the sea.
All right, thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, Peter. Are we offline?